The Wedding Banquet is Andrew's fourth feature as director and cements his position as one of the most important chroniclers of queer Asian American life in contemporary cinema. His debut in 2016 was Spa Night. It was followed by the beautiful and understated Driveways in 2019, which featured one of the final performances by the great Brian Dennehy. And his third film in 2022 was the joyous Fire Island. Andrew's also directed episodes of Bridgerton, Pride, Generation, and This Close for the small screen. James is an award-winning producer, director, and writer. His collaboration as a producer and writer with Ang Lee saw the pair bring to the screen, amongst many other films, The Wedding Banquet, Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, The Ice Storm, and Brokeback Mountain. He was the co-founder and former CEO of Focus Features, which ushered in a whole series of cutting-edge films and a new generation of directors. And he made his feature directorial debut in 2016 with Indignation, which, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the finest big screen adaptations of Philip Roth's work. And I will say there is no one in contemporary cinema that looks quite as natty with a bow tie as James. It's always impressed me. We're going to go back and talk about some of your earlier work, but let's start with this new version of The Wedding Banquet and the genesis of it. Let's start with you, Andrew.
I think the first conversations happened without me. I think James and Joe Pirro had a conversation with our producer, Anita Guo, and she held the rights to the original and was interested in, thinking about a potential remake, reimagining. And I had just worked with James and Joe on Driveways, and they had brought my name up to Anita, and I had a conversation with her at Sundance, and kind of did not want to touch the original film because I love it so much. I've talked about this a lot, but I saw the original film when I was 8 years old, when it was in a video rental store, and my mother saw it and rented it, not knowing that it was a queer film, and we saw it as a family, and it kind of blew my mind, and I probably didn't even recognize at the time what it would mean to me, but that was the first gay film I'd ever seen. And the fact that it was a gay Asian film and a film that was told with so much humanity, I think really set me on this path to be the storyteller that I am today.
So James, we've got quite a length of time between the 1993 version and this new version of the film. What did it mean to you to revisit this narrative?
I think the great thing about working with and for Andrew is that I was invited to revisit it, and yet the spirit of this venture allowed me to come up to the front door and knock and then not enter again. This is not a process of remake, revision, nostalgia, even devotion. And I think the first thing that happened after Anita Guo and Carolyn Clark, our wonderful producers, that Joe and I worked with, when they spoke to Joe and said, "Hey, we have these rights," and he got these rights through Central Motion Picture of not just The Wedding Banquet, but Ang's two other first films, that trilogy, the Father Knows Best trilogy, Pushing Hands, and Eat, Drink, Man, Woman. And they were so respectful. They said, "We just want to know if James and Ang would be offended if we, pursued a remake." And I think the answer back that Joe made was, yes, we would be offended unless there were a filmmaker like Andrew Ahn who could really take something and make it new. And so I think the biggest gift that I think we all received from Ang and that I was able to help deliver is to say to Andrew, and through Andrew, he radiated this, would say, fuck it, just make a movie. That's the biggest gift that we could get from this process.
So Andrew, this is your first feature-length screenplay since your feature debut, Spa Night. Was it just something you decided right from the outset? I do actually want to be involved in the writing process on this.
Yeah, I think I have so much respect for the original film and the work that James and Ang did. There was no way that I was going to make that film better, and so I just had to make my own film. And there were kind of things happening in my life that were kind of in dialogue with the original film that I felt like I could then use as inspiration for this, and namely, my boyfriend and having these conversations around marriage and having kids. One of the first conversations that he and I had about having children, he told me, it's like, well, it's like if it happens, it happens, which is a line in the movie. And I said, no, it doesn't, not for gay people, And it was in that conversation that I realized that for queer people, having children has to be extremely intentional. Like there's no whoopsie daisying a baby into existence. And, and then so any hesitation becomes a giant obstacle. And for me, that kind of felt so sad because I think queer people are amazing caregivers and should be given the opportunities to be parents. And so that became a real kind of creative North Star in the process of making this. Working with James on the screenplay, it wasn't like, how do we make this like the original? It was really its own, its own story, its own conversations. And that to me, gave me the confidence that we could endeavor to do this, amongst the kind of legacy of the original film.
I know process is not always an easy thing to articulate, to dive into, but I am curious about the process of collaboration in writing. I've had to go a couple of times with someone else, and they've almost killed me because of my procrastination. So I'm just quite curious about the balance and actually how you co-write.
So I think what you just said was really interesting, because to me the idea that writing is a solitary singular process is already one of the issues, right? We have this idea that that's what it is, and so. My collaborations have often been with the world's greatest procrastinator, myself, right? So that tension and that stress is already there. But what Andrew does as a filmmaker from beginning to end is to create space for a very pointed, very directional, but also with a collaboration that he puts people in play. And so the writing process went all the way through the end of production and beyond with this cast. Obviously, if you have people like Bowen and Yang around and you're making something that you want people to think is funny, you're not going to tell Bowen to shut up and just say his lines. But you are going to create a space that you control, that has a vision that everybody understands and shares, right? And so this was just a wild process, because Andrew did come back and met the one precondition that I did feel was important spiritually for Ang. And that is, he came back with you'll see when you see the film, and it's all these incredible ideas, including, let's say, doubling the fun of the main character. Suddenly we had two couples, and you would think that as an arithmetic addition to the dramaturgy and the narrative challenge. It is not. It is an algorithmically explosive, mind-boggling kind of engineering problem that comes up. So through the course of development, which also included Joe and other producers, it really became a kind of fun, I would say almost kind of vacuum for me to start doing the kind of engineering work that I love to do when you're crafting stuff that requires the kind of structure and narrative economy to get everybody on that poster to go from here to there, each on their own journey and each in relationship to every single other character, and make the film less than 327 hours. Right? But that was the generosity that Andrew brought to this process. We were really just feeding into this. I don't know you're not a machine, you're a human, but this energy that almost voraciously was able to scoop up all this activity and all this contribution, and me included, which was such a gift.
It was a like a long process. Like, we had been working on this for a number of years, and I had started this process, with this team before Fire Island, before I even knew about Fire Island, and had to go make that movie. And yeah, I just remember just like so many conversations. Like, we just had to talk through everything and look at each scene. Took a field trip up to James's place, and like just like meals and drinks to just kind of figure out what is the spirit of this, and then the kind of just the architecture of it, which is really immense. In some ways, I was telling James this when we were working on it, like, watching Eat, Drink, Man, Woman was actually very helpful because there's such a large cast in that, almost, just as helpful as the Wedding Banquet itself. So it was there's so many, it's not just the craft and the structure, but also the emotions, like they all have to somehow click and make sense.
So something that I found fascinating until I started researching for this event. I didn't realize that you'd worked together on Driveways, but when I found out that you were making the Wedding Banquet with James on board, it struck me as an incredibly natural thing, because looking at your work and James, whether we're talking about Eat, Drink, Man, Woman or The Ice Storm or Ride with the Devil, there are events in these films, but everything seems to come out of character. And I know that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but there are certain films I watch where I think, okay, someone sat down, they worked out a plot, and now they're trying to fit everything in, and I feel like I'm watching a plot-driven film. What's extraordinary about both your bodies of work is the minutiae of the characters' lives that we're informed of, but also just the way that the characters so freely flow off the screen. I'm curious about the creation of the characters and the interaction with the actual narrative, and how easy that sort of came to you in relation to this film.
That's you, man.
I'll say, like, maybe a little crudely, like, Bowen and Kelly are my boyfriend, and I'm Han Gi-chan and Lily Gladstone. Like, it was just, that was kind of a rough way to look at it, but I think it really was a process. Like, these weren't fully formed characters, at the very top. I think we had kind of dynamics that we were interested in, and wants. Those were kind of foundational. But I remember there was a draft when James was like, what if Chris was a birder? And I loved that. And it felt just so kind of organic to the character, as someone who, loves to kind of observe, but isn't necessarily taking so much action in his life. And, so there are all these things that just kind of built on the characters. And of course there were adjustments. We would go one direction and realize it didn't feel quite right. So it was just kind of a slow build up of the kind of three-dimensionality of these characters.
And I would say too that your question proffers a wonderful binary, plot versus character, right? But often I find amongst, in particular, my American colleagues, that distinction collapses, because there's a very specific sense of character as something that is set. Form that, this character, this character, their wants, their desires, what they like to eat for breakfast, and then you realize, like, no, you're a person because you relate to other people, and as you relate to other people, the plot changes, the narrative changes. So once again, that kind of the sense of solidity and uniformity that comes about by those distinctions can often congeal itself, and you end up reproducing the same. It's plot and it's character. Well, what is that? It's the same thing. Yeah. And I think one of the things that, again, is both process and outcome of Andrew's approach, even with his actors, was that the characters continued to form themselves in rehearsal and even on set with the actors. So when you see the final film, there's often moments in it that I'll look at like, I know I wrote that joke about Star Trek, but now it's a joke about Star Wars and it's in a different scene. And but so it's not like, because the characters themselves came alive in the process that then lifted everything, right? And so you find that the character you find at the end is when you find the character, right? Interesting.
I know, obviously, none of you have seen it, so we don't want to go into too much detail about what happens in the film. But anyone who's seen the 1993 version, one of the main characters in it is played by Seong Lung, who's the father who appears in the first three of Ang Lee's films, the Father Knows Best trilogy. One shift we do have is from the father to the mothers, the plural. Again, was that a decision that came quite early?
That was an early decision, and I think it was a conversation. You know, I know Anita, and I talked about that, and again, I think it was also just like you're not going to make the Wedding Banquet, Ang Lee's Wedding Banquet, better. Like that movie, for me, like that father-son relationship is so beautifully rendered. That I wanted to philosophically, take that approach to these characters and relationships, but like mine a different relationship, and I think that, some of these first thoughts felt invigorating and inspiring, that we, followed them. But yeah, as James said, it was a kind of ever evolving conversation. The character of Jae-young, played by Yoon Yo-jung from Minari, she was originally a mother, and then when we cast Yoon Yo-jung, she was like, I'm a little old for this character. What if we make her grandmother? And that brought up a whole new kind of tension and drama, kind of responsibility to her grandson, that I think really enriches the film.
It's that funny thing that when people talk about sequels, it's often the idea that, the sequel's always bigger. And what I think is fascinating about this film is that the canvas has been expanded, but it's richer. Not necessarily richer than the original film, but just what you come away with is incredibly rich, because you have this intergenerational narrative and an even more international element.
Well, I think so. And also, one of the gifts of riding along on this journey was also to see the center of narrative and emotional gravity. That is to say, a sense of what makes a protagonist of any given story shift generations. So with Ang's first three films that I got to work with him on, that center of gravity really was this patriarch. Seong Lung was just an amazing person and actor, and somebody who we just lovingly crafted these movies around what he could bring to them, in a sense. But it was a sense of a patriarch in each of those movies, understanding his own desire needed to be freed from the very structures that regulated his relationship to the world, right? So we were focused on that, and the emotions that lead to the final gesture of the earlier Wedding Banquet, which are now mimicked at the end of Andrew's version, with somebody from a different generation. That the younger generation now has both the burden, but also, I think, quite rightfully, the place to carry that narrative weight, the weight of the people who the light bulb is going to go off for, that they're the ones who are also liberating themselves in the process. So it's a very different film in that way.
We're going to see a quick clip from the 1993 version of the Wedding Banquet, and this is the moment where the couple are figuring out the subterfuge that will mask their relationship to parents who are visiting from China, and it features Winston Chu and Mitchell Lichtenstein. If we can see the clip, please. It was funny. I haven't seen the film for quite a long time, and I forgot about the present when he opens it. I just went, why has he got him a walkie-talkie? Oh no, that's a mobile phone. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, these are the tricks that history plays on you, because on the one hand, one could celebrate that scene as the first boy-on-boy kiss in commercial Taiwanese and much of Chinese speaking Asia at the time. There have been other films that had those kids, but had not had that kind of commercial release, and so it's understood. The history makes that scene, right? But on the other hand, as you revisit, you're like, oh man, the army radios that we had as the first adapters of mobile phones technology, and of course, they signified at that time. Yeah. I know this as a fact because I possessed one of these with the little radio. It had the almost like with a battery and everything. Anybody who had one of those phones was an asshole. It's just like, what a jerk, like you really need to be on the phone outside, you know what I mean? So that's really where, history really reconfigures everything when you encounter it.
Another aspect of history, and I don't want this to descend too much into politics, because I'm sure many people have had enough of that at the moment, but this is a film that was made at a moment when rights that had long been fought for were being won. And we now have a film that's coming out when, unbelievably, many of those rights are now under threat. And yet, at the same time, what I think is extraordinary about the Wedding Banquet 2025 is it is something that says these are our rights and we're going to celebrate it. And I think that black cloud that seems horrible, we still need to remember that we have to celebrate as well. And I think this is something that your film does incredibly well.
I wish it weren't so fraught, and it makes me incredibly anxious. I can only hope that this film coming out today is an opportunity for people to, kind of build community, watch this film together, gain some strength, and then be able to go out there and fight for what is portrayed on screen. But yeah, it's so fascinating, kind of thinking about the two films and the era in which they were made and coming out, and I think it just shows you it's never a guarantee. It's always kind of this pendulum swing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what was it like, not just getting the film made, but the reception at this moment in time in the early 90s? Because this is the era of new queer cinema, and it was just this incredible explosion of brilliant films.
It was, and I was so lucky to be adjacent and somewhat something of a participant at that moment, with the tremendous films that were being produced by Christine Vachon and directed by people like Todd Haynes and Tom Kalin and Rose Trochet, and having these brilliant activist thinker doers like B. Ruby Rich, who coined that phrase "new queer cinema" in the early '90s. That phrase reflected on a cinema that was alternative and considered marginal, of course, because it was, to mainstream dominant cinema narrative conventions, right? Poison, Swoon. So there was a very fierce discourse around aesthetic innovation and political activism and radicalism. So at the same time I'm working with these amazing people, I'm also working with an amazing guy named Ang Lee and myself, who were just kind of like these cishet middle-brow dudes who also, think that there's a space within dominant culture that queers and non-conforming everybody's has a right to. That's your space too. And in fact, that dominant culture, when you go back and look at it, if you look at screwball comedies of the 40s, they're all queer. Like, it just is what it is. That's civilization, that's culture. And so it was an interesting moment because we made the film and with some trepidation that in fact, both who we were and what we were doing would be seen as a kind of a retro step backwards from the vanguard work that was being done by so many brilliant artists. And so we were gratified that in fact it turns out that you can hold both these truths. Like, you love avant-garde and counter cinema, and you also can revisit a revision, which is what we consciously thought we were doing, which was going inside the screwball comedy, something that Stanley Cavell, the great Harvard philosopher and film lover, had called the comedy of remarriage, and flip it and say, no, this is your culture too. Enjoy this too. And so it was a real moment when we came back after the Berlin Film Festival and sold the film, much to our surprise, frankly, for distribution all over the world. And our first screening in New York City was for a gay men's health crisis. And we thought, oh, this could go any way. And it was just, again, that moment, which we all experienced just recently at Sundance, and I hope tonight folks will be experiencing here at BFI Flair, when queer joy, all joy is a superpower. It's actually something, it's part of your fight to exist. It's part of your fight for everybody to share. It's particular, but it's universal. And we had that experience, and we knew that okay, we're good. We're good to go.
And Andrew, you already mentioned being at a young age when you first saw The Wedding Banquet, but this cinema that emerged around this time, as you were developing as a filmmaker, did this have any impact on sort of your own film education?
Yeah, I'll say it's so interesting. I haven't heard some of that, and so it was really fun for me because I think I always put The Wedding Banquet in that same camp as Poison, but realized, oh, you were probably seen really differently back then. I've always talked about The Wedding Banquet as being so subversive, actually, in its kind of trying to tell a very queer story within the kind of a mainstream, container. But yeah, I think it wasn't until film school, really, where I started to watch new queer cinema, in that era, like Gregor Rocky films, Cheryl Dunye, and I realized that that my identity as a queer person, could really, offer me a path, and I remember, when I came out to my parents, actually, the first question that my mom asked me was is this going to hurt your career? And I was like, no, actually, I think it really gives me meaning, and so, yeah, I feel so fortunate that I've been able to work with James and work with Christine Vachon, because it just feels like, yeah, this is it's a legacy, it's a history that I'm a part of, and hope that, I can continue to cultivate for future generations, because it's not, I don't want my films to exist in a vacuum. I want them to kind of tell the story of queer people, and that to me would be, a fulfilling legacy, something that I would be very happy to, to work my entire life for.
We're going to see a clip from Andrew's second feature, 2019's Driveways now. And we're sort of jumping around with the film clips, but the reason I wanted to show this now is that I feel it has something intrinsic in common with the two versions of The Wedding Banquet that is increasingly rare. It's a film about kindness, and it stunned me to just watch this film and just to feel this emotion flowing off the screen. The scene you're about to see features Lucas J, who's a young boy who's moved with his mother, played by Hong Chow, into a house next door to Brian Dennehy's Korean veteran, who's a little grumpy at first, but then this beautiful relationship develops between the boy and this old man. If we can see the clip, please. Like many people, I didn't quite realize what a sucker punch it would be by the end, and I didn't have enough tissues in the house. It is a really, really beautiful film, but how did your collaboration begin on this film?
I remember getting the script from Joe Pirro, who had been working with the writers Hannah Boss and Paul Thureen, and he was like, "I think you're going to be into this," and I read it and I loved it, but I also like didn't totally understand my way in, and I kind of it's like a little reductive, but I said, "What if I made them Asian?" And these characters, and Joe and James were like, "Yeah, like that's exciting. Like, who would you want to cast?" And that's something that I had tried before in the industry, saying like, "Oh, this character that's not, their ethnicity is not specified. What if I made them Asian?" And it never worked. And so this was the first time it did. And for me, I think there was just a shared value, amongst the producers and amongst the writers and myself that like, oh, like this is a story about people who feel like they're kind of on the outside, and for me, I wanted to physicalize that in Kathy and Cody's race. But I remember our first conversation. We talked a lot about like Ozu and Koreeda, and I love what you said about kindness, because I think actually the most heartbreaking drama and conflict can often come about because people love each other so much. And I love that, in Driveways and then also in The Wedding Banquet, there isn't necessarily a villain, right? There's not an easy person that you can say this is the cause of all the problems. It's that these characters are struggling with how much they feel for each other and wanting to protect that, or wanting to, give people something that they might not be able to give. There's so much that can be explored that I think is, for me, just feels more responsible to tell these kinds of stories.
Yeah, and I'm debating with myself whether to share this anecdote here about a relationship that I have to that scene in particular, and discussions that we had in the making of Driveways, which I hope everybody gets a chance to see. We're so proud of it. It's such a beautiful film. It dropped, as they say, at the beginning of the pandemic, so we're almost exactly 5 years ago this week. So we're really at a moment. It's so interesting to share this. But that scene in particular, working in development with again my colleague Joe Pirro, who really led the charge on the development of Driveways, and who had brought in these amazing playwrights, Paul and Hannah, who have since gone on to showrun and create one of the great TV shows out there about kindness, Somebody Somewhere, which is really just and also a big recommend. But in the development of that script, there was a moment, because it was again very intensive and really collaborative. When I brought to the table a concept of this kid, which then very interestingly, Andrew, in our discussions we kept, I don't know how to say, in its own bubble. But I have a kid who at around that age was reading a lot of those manga, a very specific kind of manga where the boys look like girls, right? And to me, that, and I think to everybody, as we were working on the script, there's a kind of opening to the sense of who this kid might become or be. And then years later, which I had no idea, when you tell the story as an 8-year-old of watching The Wedding Banquet, going, what? And I was like, what? That kid? But the kid is not, that character is not queer in Driveways, but there's queer coding clearly associated with who he is and his journey, right? And so being here this year at BFI Flair, I get to be Nepo Dad, because then last year the kid that I was inspired by to participate in this discussion about precisely that had their film at BFI Flair last year, Summer Solstice, Noah Schamus. And we keep church and state, so they're going to kill me for even mentioning their name, because I'm not allowed to do anything, but it's a great film. I'm really plugging it now. But it was wonderful to see that, to have that feeling of just connection, but also separation. But everybody is on their own, they're doing their thing, right? But yeah.
I do want to open the floor to questions from you, but before we do, I just want to show, it's a very brief clip from Andrew's first feature, Spa Night, from 2016. And it's interesting because you have the main character's parents concerned over the problem of him possibly choosing a non-Korean girlfriend, but that might not be the biggest impediment in their finally having a daughter-in-law. Let's see the clip. I hadn't seen this film before this event was announced, so I watched it in research, and it's one of the highlights of my cinematic year so far.
Cool.
Seeing this film, I think it's wonderful, and the subtlety of the looks that you see in the film. Before I open to the audience, I've just got one question, and it covers both of your careers. A couple of weeks ago, the BFI had Bong Joon-ho here, and he's asked a question about moving between drama and comedy, and he just said, well, it's all just one thing, but both of your instincts for balancing pathos and humor is quite remarkable. Is it literally that? Is it instinct? It's a gut reaction. You just know when something's going to drop that's going to allow you to shift.
Oh, I would say it's many different instincts. And if you saw the look that Andrew just gave, probably no, because we both absorbed. It is the most stressful thing you can try to do in cinema in a collaborative process when every little look shifts that balance. And we especially in post-production, we was just like a lot of genuine, like just chewing every bone, and then finally watching Andrew take it home and achieve that balance. But it's really hard. I think it's the hardest thing to do, and it's emotionally, especially for a director. If you're a writer producer, you're just kind of like, what about that? But to carry that weight and to feel that you have to just eventually just take that leap and get that balance, I think there's nothing hard. Look, if you make a flat out comedy, you run it to a test screening, and they laugh or they don't laugh. If you make the most profound drama, then even if you go to Sundance and everybody hates it, they're just idiots, right? It's pretty clear in that case. If you're in the Andrew Ahn zone, there's nothing to test at the end of the day, except your own will to find what you think is the right place to land. And it's really hard. And Aang and Andrew both have that.
It's an incredible amount of work. It's so much work, like James saying, like chewing on the bones, like it's that's such a great, metaphor for it. Director Bong, maybe it's really easy for him, but it is incredibly difficult. It's so much fine tuning, and but I think what's incredible about the, I don't know, like quote unquote, like dramedy, right, is that if you do it right, it just does feel like so much like real life, and watching that clip from the 1993 Wedding Banquet, like it just, like that feels so good, and it feels like life in a way that, like a kind of pure comedy or a pure drama might not feel reflective. And so there is something about the combination of the two that I think there's so much work that has to be done, and there's looking at every line, every look, and then of course also then being able to step back and really see the macro landscape. So it's exhausting, and I'm still recovering.
Let's take some questions from the audience.
It really felt like spinning plates, like you have to be able to spin the plate hard enough that it'll kind of sustain itself, and then you run over, and then you spin another plate, and then you have to run back. And but I think we were very committed to telling an ensemble story. This is a film about chosen family, and so I definitely wanted it to feel like a community perspective, but yeah, just so much kind of labor to make that feel the way it does.
I think that it goes back to what we were saying before, but that the engineering job, as I saw it, as my contribution, but not locking into a system that felt too foreclosed. Like how to maintain the space that Andrew needed to create these moments with his actors that were open ended, that could feel that way, and yet if you open up the hood on this thing, it is just totally engineered. Because otherwise, it would just never work. And so it's that was really that was a lot of work. We had a lot of work. That's all you say. It was labor.
Sort of following on from that, casting.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, it's fantastic. How quickly? Obviously, you've worked with Bowen before, but how quickly did all that come together?
You know, it took time, and we had a writer strike and an actors strike that kind of got in the way. But our casting director, Jenny Ju, is incredible. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, Yoon Yo-jung, that character was supposed to be Mother. And so we were trying to kind of have that conversation about potential actresses. And then, of course, you know, that thought came up. And so, you know, we had to sometimes take a step away from the character as written and imagine who could, you know, kind of really at its core get that character, even if some of the, you know, the details might be different.
Lily Gladstone, who...
Yeah, Lily Gladstone, that character was not a native character, you know, originally. And then in the kind of conversations with her, you know, she, you know, wanted to pay homage to a Duwamish figure of note, Princess Angeline, to name her character after, who's the daughter of Chief Seattle, who Seattle is named after. And that was so, you know, I think it, we made those adjustments in the screenplay to reflect that. And so, you know, I think the casting was, we had to be flexible. We couldn't be super rigid. And that, I think, also gave us the sense of, yeah, just the kind of holistic quality of this ensemble, that they really felt like they belonged together. And then just working with the actors, I mean, we cast incredibly generous, vulnerable actors. And I think it's such a special ensemble that, you know, I hope audiences watch it and feel like they want to be a part of that family.
I did come away from the screening thinking I want both couples as my neighbors.
Yeah.
That would just be fun.
Yeah, I think there's two registers that are working in your question, because the Stanislavskian thing is really a methodology that you attach to, that actors and often directors will attach to, that method approach, right? And then there's the British approach, which is just, you're really trained and you're just great. And both those are valid in their own ways, and then you mix them up and you get all kinds of crazy stuff going. That's what directors do all the time, deal with, they're all coming from different places, right? All the actors come. But for me, I was thinking more in terms of just the notion of, at the dramaturgical level, where this idea that there's plot-driven versus character-driven, right? And that opposition collapses when you really put too much pressure on it, especially when you have a director like Andrew. So it's not so much as if you don't know who the characters are and what they, you know them, but what you don't yet know is what happens when a director and that actor is in a room in rehearsal with the other actors, and they start pinging off each other. And then have you constrain them through the script into a kind of bloodless, locked in vibe that it's just determined? Or is the script really a dare to your director and your actors to, even if they're saying the same lines that you wrote and the same ending of the thing, the same wedding at the end of the comedy, but that process of getting there, they've discovered something completely new about themselves and each other that they would not have done had they not been in that process. Does that make sense? So you really are relying on a director in particular who can really create that space. I mean, I always said to Ang, as we worked in our careers and started working in the studio system, I said, you have to understand, when I write for you, and when I was working with and writing with Andrew is the same thing. I'm writing you basically a dare. Just like, are you brave enough to jump into this pond? We don't even know how deep it is, right? When I write for studios, because I've done a fair amount of production rewrites and big movies, sometimes I'm credited, I won't tell you, but whatever. And I said to Ang, when you write for a studio, you write a battleship. Your script is a battleship, which even a mediocre director can't ruin. That's what the executives read the scripts for that purpose, right? So it's always a recipe for just like the not great, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'll kind of to add to that, I think, the script is so helpful and you always do go back to it. I love how you describe it as a dare. It is, for me, important to, not puppet your actors, because then that's when you get really two-dimensional characters. And this is what I love about, James and Ang's previous collaborations is that like these people feel like people who exist outside of the frames of this movie. And that is such a difficult to create feeling. But, some of the things that I've learned is, to really listen to your actors. One thing that I love doing is having characters, having the actors create secrets from me, that they have with each other. That I never want to hear, because there's something about secrets that feel like humanity, and I remember in film school having, people tell me, you have to know everything about your character. And I was like, I don't know everything about myself. And so this character is going to feel like so, like not a real human. And so, just anything you can do to create that environment where, kind of within the screenplay or using the screenplay as a tool, as a jumping off point, build real human beings through the directorial process. Like that for me, that's discovery. That's the fun of being on set. I really love that collaborative process.